Daniel Carter had always believed in doing the right thing. He was a police officer, not the kind who sat behind a desk, but one who worked on the streets every day. He grew up in a small neighborhood where crime was common, and from a young age, he saw how dangerous life could become when people followed the wrong path. That is what pushed him to join the police force. He wanted to protect people, to bring justice, and to make sure that families could sleep peacefully at night. For years, he worked simple cases, robberies, small gangs, and street fights. But deep inside, he always felt he was meant for something bigger. One day, everything changed. Daniel was called into a private meeting with senior officers. The room felt different from the usual briefings. It was quiet, serious, and filled with tension. Sitting across from him were men he rarely saw, people who worked on high-level cases. They told him about a powerful Mafia group that had been growing for years. This group was not just involved in small crimes. They controlled illegal businesses, moved large amounts of money, and had connections everywhere. Many officers had tried to bring them down, but they always failed. The Mafia was too careful, too secretive, and too dangerous. Daniel listened closely as they explained the plan. They needed someone to go undercover, someone who could live among the Mafia members, gain their trust, and collect information from the inside. It was not a short mission. It could take years. It would be dangerous, and there would be no easy way out once it started. Daniel felt his heart beat faster. This was not just another case. This was a life-changing decision. At first, he hesitated. He thought about his family, his friends, and the life he would have to leave behind. Going undercover meant disappearing. He would have to create a new identity, cut contact with everyone he knew, and live as someone else. If the Mafia discovered the truth, there would be no second chances. Still, he could not ignore the opportunity. This was the kind of mission that could stop a powerful criminal network and save many lives. After a long moment of silence, Daniel looked up and agreed. The next few weeks were intense. Daniel went through special training designed for undercover work. He learned how to act like a criminal, how to speak differently, and how to hide his true emotions. They gave him a new name, a new background, and a full story that he had to memorize perfectly. Every detail mattered. One mistake could expose him. He practiced every day until his new identity felt real, almost like he was becoming another person. But training was not just about acting. He also had to learn how to survive. He was taught how to read people, how to notice danger before it happened, and how to stay calm in stressful situations. There were moments when he doubted himself. Late at night, he would sit alone and wonder if he was ready for this. The fear was real, but so was his determination. He reminded himself why he chose this path in the first place. Finally, the day came when everything was set. Daniel stood alone in a small room, looking at himself in the mirror. The man staring back at him was no longer just a police officer. He was someone else now, someone who was about to step into a world filled with danger and lies. He took a deep breath, knowing there was no turning back. As he walked out to begin his new life, he had no idea how deep he would go, or how much it would change him. And the moment he made his first move into the Mafia's world, everything began to shift in ways he could not yet understand. Daniel stepped into his new life with a name that was not his own. He was no longer a police officer. Now he was Marco Silva, a man with a rough past, someone who had moved from place to place doing small illegal jobs. His story was carefully built, every detail designed to make him believable. He had fake records, contacts, and even a history of minor crimes that could be traced if anyone checked. But even with all that preparation, the real test was not the story. It was the people he had to convince. His first step into the Mafia world was slow and careful. He knew he could not rush things. People in that world did not trust easily. One wrong move, one wrong word, and everything could fall apart. So he started small. He spent time in places where criminals were known to gather, dark bars, back rooms, and hidden clubs. He listened more than he spoke, watching how people behaved, learning the rules that were never written down but always followed. After some time, Daniel, now Marco, met a man named Victor. Victor was not a big name in the Mafia, but he was connected. He handled small deals, moved money, and worked under more powerful men. Getting close to someone like Victor was the perfect way in. Their first meeting was simple, just a conversation over drinks. Marco acted confident but not too eager. He shared parts of his fake past, enough to sound real but not enough to raise suspicion. Victor listened carefully, his eyes always watching, always judging. Days turned into weeks, and Marco kept showing up. He proved himself in small ways. He helped with minor tasks, things that seemed simple but were actually tests. Delivering packages, sending messages, keeping watch. These were not big crimes, but they were important steps. Every task was a chance to prove he could be trusted. And slowly, Victor began to believe in him. One night, Victor gave Marco his first real job. It was a small deal, a simple exchange of money and goods. But Daniel knew this was a turning point. If he did well, he would be allowed deeper into the group. If he failed, everything could end right there. The tension was heavy as he arrived at the meeting place. Every sound, every movement made him alert. But he kept his face calm, just like he was trained to do. The deal went smoothly. Marco played his part perfectly. He spoke little, stayed focused, and followed instructions exactly. When it was over, Victor nodded, a small sign of approval, but it meant everything. From that moment, Marco was no longer just an outsider. He was becoming part of something bigger. As time passed, Marco was introduced to more people. Some were friendly, others cold and suspicious. He learned quickly that in this world, respect was everything. You had to earn it, and you had to protect it. One mistake could make you look weak, and weakness was dangerous. So he stayed sharp, always careful with his words and actions. He also met members of the Mafia families. These were not just criminals. They were people with strong bonds, connected by loyalty and fear. They treated each other like family, but there was always tension beneath the surface. Power struggles, hidden secrets, and silent rivalries filled the air. Marco had to learn who to trust and who to avoid, even though he knew that in truth, he could trust no one. Living this new life was not easy. Every day, Daniel had to remind himself who he really was. It was easy to get lost in the role, to start thinking like Marco instead of Daniel. Sometimes he would catch himself reacting the way a criminal would, not the way a police officer should. Those moments scared him. They reminded him how thin the line was between his real self and the identity he had created. He also had to stay in contact with the police, but this was one of the most dangerous parts of the mission. Meetings had to be secret, quick, and carefully planned. He could not risk being followed or watched. Sometimes, weeks would pass without any contact, leaving him completely alone in the Mafia world. During those times, the pressure felt heavier than ever. One evening, things took a serious turn. Victor told Marco that someone important wanted to meet him. This was not a small step. It meant that Marco had been noticed by higher-level members of the Mafia. It was a sign of trust, but also a sign of danger. The higher he climbed, the more risk he faced. The meeting took place in a quiet, well-guarded house. Inside, Marco met a man named Lorenzo, one of the key figures in the organization. Lorenzo was calm, quiet, and very observant. He did not speak much, but when he did, his words carried weight. He asked Marco questions about his past, his work, and his loyalty. Each question felt like a test, carefully designed to find any weakness or lie. Marco answered with confidence, sticking to his story. He did not rush, did not panic. Inside, his heart was beating fast, but on the outside, he stayed calm. The room was silent for a moment after he finished speaking. Then Lorenzo gave a slight nod. From that moment, everything changed. Marco was no longer just working small jobs. He was now part of something much deeper. The tasks became bigger, the risks higher, and the secrets darker. He was stepping further into a world that was hard to escape. A world where trust was rare, and danger was always close. And as Marco continued to move forward, gaining trust and becoming more involved, he began to realize that the deeper he went, the harder it would be to come back. Because this was only the beginning of a life that was about to test him in ways he had never imagined. Living as Marco Silva was no longer something Daniel had to think about. It had become his daily life. Every morning, he woke up not as a police officer, but as a man inside the Mafia. The line between his real identity and his fake one was starting to blur. At first, he had to remind himself who he really was, but now it came less often. That scared him more than anything. He knew that if he forgot why he was there, he could lose himself completely. His days were filled with activity. He spent most of his time around Mafia members, learning how they worked, how they spoke, and how they trusted each other. They were not always violent or loud like he had once imagined. Many times they were calm, careful, and even friendly with one another. They shared meals, laughed, and talked about their families. It made everything more confusing. These were criminals, but they also acted like normal people. That made it harder for Daniel to separate right from wrong in his mind. At the same time, the work he was involved in became more serious. He was no longer just delivering packages or watching over small deals. Now, he was helping plan operations, moving larger amounts of money, and sometimes standing guard during dangerous meetings. He had to stay alert all the time. One small mistake could lead to questions, and questions could lead to suspicion. There were moments when the danger felt very real. One night, during a meeting in a warehouse, something unexpected happened. A deal between two groups started to go wrong. Voices became louder, tension filled the room, and hands moved closer to weapons. Daniel stood still, trying not to show fear. He watched every movement carefully, ready to react if things turned violent. For a few seconds, it felt like everything would explode. But somehow, the situation calmed down. Still, that moment stayed in his mind. It reminded him how quickly things could change. Communication with the police became harder as time went on. At the beginning, he had regular contact, but now it was less frequent. The deeper he went, the more careful he had to be. Meetings with his handlers were rare and always risky. Sometimes he had to pass information in secret ways, leaving messages in hidden places or using coded words during short phone calls. There were long periods when he had no contact at all, and during those times, he felt completely alone. The loneliness was one of the hardest parts. Daniel could not talk to anyone about what he was going through. He could not call his family or meet old friends. Even when he was surrounded by people, he felt isolated. No one around him knew the truth, and he could not trust anyone enough to tell them. At night, when everything was quiet, his thoughts became louder. He would sit alone, thinking about his past life, wondering if he would ever return to it. There were also moments when his cover almost broke. One afternoon, a man in the group started asking him unexpected questions about his past. The questions were detailed and came quickly, like a test. Daniel had to think fast, answering without hesitation. He stuck to his story, using the details he had memorized during training, but inside, he felt the pressure building. One wrong answer could have ended everything. After a tense few minutes, the man seemed satisfied and moved on, but Daniel knew he had come very close to being exposed. Another time, he noticed something even more dangerous. Someone had been watching him. It was not obvious at first, just small signs. A glance that lasted too long, a person appearing in the same places more than once. Daniel could not be sure if it was real or just his imagination, but he knew he could not ignore it. From that moment, he became even more careful. He changed his routines, stayed alert, and avoided drawing attention to himself. Despite all the risks, Daniel continued to do his job. He collected information whenever he could, remembering details, faces, and conversations. Every piece of information was important, It was the only way the police could understand how the Mafia worked from the inside. But gathering information was not easy. He had to do it without being noticed, without making anyone suspicious. It was like walking on a thin line every day. Emotionally, the pressure kept growing. Daniel found himself struggling with his own thoughts. Sometimes he felt guilty for being part of illegal activities, even if it was for a greater purpose. Other times he felt anger towards the criminals, especially when he saw the effects of their actions. But he could not show any of it. He had to stay in control, always acting like Marco, never like Daniel. The people around him were also starting to trust him more. Victor treated him like a close partner now, and even Lorenzo began to include him in more important discussions. This was a good sign for the mission, but it also meant more risk. The closer he got to them, the harder it would be to step away. Trust in the Mafia was a powerful thing, and breaking it could have serious consequences. As days turned into months, Daniel realized that this was no longer just a mission. It was a life he was living, a role he could not escape. The deeper he went, the more complicated everything became. Every choice had consequences, and every step forward pulled him further into the darkness. And as his responsibilities continued to grow, and the trust around him became stronger, Daniel could feel that something bigger was coming, something that would push him even further into danger and force him to make decisions that could change everything. By now, Marco Silva was no longer seen as a newcomer. He had become someone important inside the group. People listened when he spoke, and they trusted him with serious work. This was exactly what the mission needed, but it also meant that the danger around him had grown much bigger. The higher he moved in the Mafia, the closer he got to the most powerful and most dangerous people. Lorenzo, one of the leaders, began to take a special interest in him. He would call Marco into private meetings, asking for his opinion and testing his thinking. These were not simple talks. Lorenzo wanted to see how Marco handled pressure, how he made decisions, and most importantly, where his loyalty stood. Marco had to be very careful. He could not agree too quickly, but he also could not show doubt. Every word had to feel natural, like it came from someone who truly belonged in that world. With this new level of trust came bigger responsibilities. Marco was now involved in planning operations, not just carrying them out. He sat in rooms where deals were discussed, where money was counted, and where decisions were made that could affect many lives. He learned how the Mafia controlled its business, how they moved money without being noticed, and how they kept their power strong. The deeper he went, the more he understood how organized and careful everything was. But this also meant he was now closer to the darkest parts of the operation. He saw things he had never seen before. There were moments when people were threatened, when fear was used to control others. These situations tested him deeply. Inside, Daniel wanted to act, to stop what was happening, but he knew he could not. If he stepped out of his role even once, everything would fall apart. So he stayed still, watching, carrying the weight of those moments in silence. At the same time, problems inside the Mafia began to grow. Not everything was as united as it looked from the outside. There were tensions between different members, small disagreements that slowly became bigger. Some people wanted more power. Others felt they were not being treated fairly. Marco noticed these cracks and understood how dangerous they could become. In a world like this, conflict often led to betrayal. One situation made this very clear. A member of the group was suspected of leaking information. No one knew for sure, but the suspicion alone was enough to create fear. The atmosphere changed quickly. People became quieter, more careful with what they said. Eyes watched each other more closely. Marco felt the pressure rise around him. If someone was truly leaking information, it could lead the group to look deeper, to question everyone, including him. Lorenzo called a meeting to deal with the situation. The room was tense, filled with silence. The suspected man stood in the center, trying to defend himself. Marco stood nearby, keeping his face calm, but inside, his thoughts were racing. This was one of the moments he had feared from the beginning. If the group started searching for a traitor, it would only be a matter of time before they looked in his direction. The questioning was intense. Lorenzo asked direct questions, watching every reaction. The man denied everything, but his fear was clear. After a long silence, Lorenzo made a decision. The man would be dealt with. No more questions, no more chances. The message was clear to everyone in the room. Loyalty was everything, and doubt would not be tolerated. That moment stayed with Marco. It was a warning, a clear sign of what would happen if he was ever discovered. For the first time, the mission felt heavier than ever. It was not just about gathering information anymore. It was about survival. Despite the fear, Marco continued to do his job. He stayed close to Lorenzo, gaining more trust with each passing day. He learned how decisions were made at the highest level, how operations were planned across different areas, and how the group stayed one step ahead of the law. Every piece of information he gathered was valuable, but it came at a cost. The deeper he went, the harder it became to separate himself from the role he was playing. There were also moments when he began to question himself. After spending so much time in that world, he started to think like them without even realizing it. He understood their logic, their choices, and sometimes even agreed with their decisions in certain situations. This scared him. It made him wonder how much of Daniel was still left inside him. One night, after a long meeting, Lorenzo did something unexpected. He invited Marco to sit with him alone. The room was quiet, the lights low. Lorenzo spoke calmly, almost like a mentor. He talked about trust, about loyalty, and about the importance of standing with the right people. Then he looked directly at Marco and said something that stayed in his mind. "You've proven yourself," Lorenzo said. "But in this life, trust is never complete. There is always a test waiting." Marco nodded, understanding the meaning behind those words. No matter how far he had come, he was still being watched. There would always be another test, another moment where he had to prove himself again. From that point on, the pressure became even more intense. Marco knew that one mistake, one wrong move could destroy everything. But at the same time, he was now closer than ever to the core of the Mafia. The information he had access to could bring the entire operation down. As the days passed, the tension inside the group continued to grow. The suspicion had not fully disappeared, and the cracks within the organization were becoming harder to hide. Marco could feel that something bigger was coming, something that would force everyone to make difficult choices. And as he stood deeper inside the Mafia than he had ever imagined, trusted by powerful men, but surrounded by danger on all sides, Marco began to realize that the next step in this mission would not just test his skills, but would push him to his absolute limit in ways he was not fully prepared for. The pressure on Marco Silva was now stronger than ever. He was no longer just part of the Mafia. He was trusted by its leaders, sitting close to the center of everything. But that trust came with a heavy cost. The police were also pushing him harder, asking for more information, faster results, and clearer details about the people at the top. Marco felt trapped between two worlds. On one side, the Mafia expected loyalty without question. On the other side, the police expected him to deliver enough evidence to bring the whole organization down. There was no space left for mistakes. One day, Marco received a secret message from his police contact. It was short but serious. A major operation was being planned by the Mafia, something bigger than anything he had seen before. The police needed details, where it would happen, who would be there, and how it would work. This could be the chance to finally take down the entire network. But getting that information would be very dangerous. Marco would have to get closer than ever before, and that meant putting himself at even greater risk. At the same time, something felt wrong inside the Mafia. The tension that had been growing did not disappear. In fact, it became worse. People were quieter, more careful. Meetings became more secret, and fewer people were invited. Marco noticed that some conversations stopped when he entered the room. It was a small sign, but in that world, small signs meant everything. Someone was still suspicious, and that made every step more dangerous. Then came the moment that almost ended everything. During a late-night meeting, Lorenzo asked Marco to stay behind after everyone else had left. The room was silent, and the air felt heavy. Lorenzo looked at him with calm but serious eyes. He began asking questions, not the usual ones, but deeper, more personal ones. He asked about Marco's past again, about small details that had not been discussed before. It felt like a test, but this time, it was different. It felt closer, sharper, more dangerous. Marco answered carefully, trying to stay calm. Inside, his mind was racing. He knew that if he showed even a small sign of fear, it could raise suspicion. The silence between each question felt long and heavy. For a moment, it seemed like Lorenzo was searching for something, trying to see beyond the story Marco had created. Then, after what felt like a long time, Lorenzo leaned back and said nothing more. The tension slowly faded, but the message was clear. Marco was being watched more closely than ever. After that night, Marco knew he had very little time left. The mission was reaching a breaking point. The police were waiting, the Mafia was growing suspicious, and the operation everyone feared was getting closer. Every move he made now could decide how everything would end. As he prepared himself for what was coming, Marco could feel that the situation was about to explode, and the next step would either bring everything down or destroy him completely. The final operation began quietly, but the tension behind it was stronger than anything Marco had ever felt. The Mafia was preparing for a major deal, one that involved large amounts of money and important people from different parts of the network. For the police, this was the moment they had been waiting for. Marco had already passed the key information, location, time, and the people involved. Now, everything depended on perfect timing. On the day of the operation, Marco stayed calm on the outside, but inside, his thoughts were heavy. He moved with the group, acting like everything was normal. Around him, the Mafia members were focused, checking details, making sure nothing went wrong. No one knew that this would be the moment that could end it all. Marco looked at their faces, people he had spent so much time with, people who trusted him. It made everything feel more complicated, but he reminded himself why he was there. The meeting took place in a large, quiet building far from the public eye. Security was tight. Armed guards watched every entrance, and no one was allowed in without being checked. Marco stayed close to Lorenzo, who seemed calm as always, giving orders in a low voice. The deal was about to begin. Then, everything changed in a single moment. Without warning, the sound of movement came from outside. Within seconds, the building was surrounded. Police units moved in quickly, blocking every exit. Loud commands filled the air as officers entered, taking control of the situation. Chaos spread through the room. Some Mafia members froze, others tried to react, but it was too late. The operation had been planned carefully, and there was no escape. Marco stepped back, raising his hands like everyone else, staying in character until the last possible second. His heart was beating fast, not from fear, but from the weight of everything coming to an end. Officers moved through the room, securing people one by one. Lorenzo looked around, his calm expression finally breaking for the first time. His eyes stopped on Marco, and for a brief moment, there was silence between them. It was a look filled with realization. Lorenzo did not say anything, but he understood. The trust, the meetings, the time they had spent working together, it had all led to this moment. Marco held his gaze for a second, then looked away as officers moved in to take Lorenzo into custody. The operation was over. In the hours that followed, the full scale of what had happened became clear. Many key members of the Mafia were arrested, and important evidence was secured. The network that had been hidden for so long was finally exposed. For the police, it was a major success, the result of years of work and sacrifice. For Daniel, it was something else entirely. When it was safe, he stepped away from the scene, no longer Marco Silva. The role he had lived for so long was finally over, but the feeling was not simple relief. It was a mix of emotions, exhaustion, silence, and something harder to explain. He had spent so much time in that world that leaving it behind did not feel easy. In the days that followed, Daniel returned to his real life, but things were different. The mission had changed him. He had seen too much, lived too much between two identities. Even though he had succeeded, part of him still carried the weight of everything he had experienced. And as he stood alone, looking ahead at a life that was finally his again, Daniel understood that while the operation was over, the memories of the life he had lived undercover would stay with him for a long time.